In this episode, Thomas Moore and Dr. Bill Randall share their wisdom about how we can find meaning in the reality that we all die, that our journey is finite. Whether this life is the end or not, it seems clear that it involves a major change in the itinerary of your journey. We will first hear from Thomas Moore, followed by Dr. Bill Randall. Am I correct that Bill mentioned that you were working on something about death or the end of life now? Are you doing that, or would you like to share something about that aspect of our life?
Well, I'm not actually writing anything about that at the moment. I always have several books going, but at the moment, that's not one. I do speak at conferences on death and dying, and I have been speaking in medical conferences now for 25 years at least. I never chose to do that. I just started getting invitations because of my books to go to these medical places. So I have visited countless hospitals and medical centers and spoken at medical conferences now all these years. And death and dying is always part of it. Because whenever I go to a medical center, one of the big issues that is presented to me from the staff, from people working there, is how do we deal with our patients who die? How do we deal with that? How are we expected to deal with it? And it's amazing to me that so many medical people have not really prepared themselves for that aspect of their work. They always tell me, of course, that in medicine there's so much to learn. They never have any time to study soft things like that. And yet that's the thing that really affects their work a great deal. Nurses and doctors and other people working in the medical world. So it's an important, very important thing, I think, to deal with that. And so when I do speak to people in those situations, I usually have several different strategies or viewpoints about death and dying. And certainly one is, the most important one I've been thinking as you've been talking, is, even with aging, that to be a human being, part of our work as we get older, as we grow up from day one, is to be a human being, to realize what being a human asks of us, and to be willing to say, okay, I am a human being. That's who I am. And part of that is our mortality, the fact that we don't live forever. And it's a very difficult, bitter thing to deal with. So we have to find some way to do it. And I think that to really make a choice to be a human being, it means that your life is only so long. That's all you get. And you make the most of that. And you don't go fighting it, because that's kind of crazy to fight being human, because that's what you've been doing all your life. You've been a human being. And so I like to see that. When I think of that, I think of my friends and people I admire who have lived and died. And they had to make that choice. I have particular stories I tell of people I've known who are wonderfully intelligent and well-read and great teachers, and had to really struggle with dying, work that thing through. But they did eventually. They did come to grips with that. So that to me is the key, to accept yourself as a human being, like other human beings. You're not different from anybody else. I think that kind of lowering yourself into humanity helps a great deal.
We just heard from Thomas Moore speaking on the theme of death, and now we will hear from Dr. Bill Randall. A topic that I also asked Thomas Moore about and would like to ask you about is the end of life or death. If you have some observations on that from a personal or more general point of view.
Yeah, it's funny you should ask that, Gary, because now as I approach retirement myself, I'm freer to read what I want to read as opposed to reading things that will go into something that I'm writing. I think of the book that Beth McKim and I wrote called Reading Our Lives, which really forced us to delve into all of this complex literature on narrative, etc. But now, when I come home at the end of the day and I have some time, there are books I like to read, like life after life or the other life on the other side, which is maybe kind of esoteric and a bit makes some people feel uncomfortable. But having been with my own dad, who died at the age of 98 here a couple of years ago, and I was with him, fortunately, in his final few hours, saw him transition. It has made me curious about death and the dying process in a way that I don't think I was before, even though I was a minister and certainly was with a lot of people during and after their deaths. But from a narrative perspective, and this is something I've been thinking about and something I've been writing over the summer, entitled "In Our Stories Lies Our Strength, Aging, Spirituality, and Narrative." From a narrative perspective, the person who is dying is going through all kinds of things, depending upon how alert and cognitively capable they are. I think our colleague David Kuhl, in his book, What Dying People Want, writes about this. In fact, he quotes our work, which is kind of nice, talks about how the urge to review one's life intensifies for many of the people that he has interviewed. He's a palliative care physician, and he interviewed palliative patients of different ages about what it is they want in their final weeks, days, months. One of them was to review their lives and to speak truth and to have truth spoken to them. I think that one of the things we could say is going on for people who are approaching death is they're, in a sense, writing the final chapter of this part of their story, at least. And writing the final chapter carries with it a lot of psychological tasks, like hopefully making amends wherever we are still able to do so, finding forgiveness in ourselves or for things that we've been part of, or forgiving others while there's still time to do so. But I think another thing that's maybe happening, and I'll just throw this out there, it might sound a little weird, is in this process of life review, which I think does tend to intensify for many people as they're dying, you might say that it's prelude to the life review process that some people who've had near-death experiences report doing or starting to do when they're on the other side, however long or short they may be on the other side. So engaging in life review at the end of this life may just be a way of kind of saving time on the other side, if you will, because we're going to have to do that anyway. So some sources would suggest. The other thing I want to throw out is that, and it kind of relates to this, is that people as they're dying may be open to different storyings or different ways of storying death itself, not as termination, but perhaps as transition. Not as final, but as an opening out. Florida Scott Maxwell talks about death as possibly a birth. I do recall, I can throw this one little story in there. When I was a minister, this one particular hot summer Saturday afternoon, I was called to the home of a particular parishioner who was being cared for by his wife at home. He was on his last legs. He was palliative. Perhaps now he would be in hospice house. And she called me desperately. He's not going to last much longer. Can you please come fast? So I went as fast as I could. She opened the front door as soon as I knocked, took me right into the master bedroom where he was lying sprawled on top of the covers, but with a strange kind of smile on his face. And the first words that I recall coming out of his mouth were, "I'm ready to go. I'm ready to go." And that stuck in my mind, like, okay, well, maybe, for some older people, as they approach the great frontier, they have some sense that, there's another journey awaiting them, the big adventure, as some would call it, the great mystery, the next chapter. So those are a few things I would throw out that I think a narrative perspective kind of underscores for me.
It's a really interesting idea that those who do are drawn to life review, because certainly whether you look at religions or spiritual traditions, they would all talk about going the other side, or maybe it isn't even another side, it's just a veil of some kind, but about that process, reviewing one's life depending on your perspective, in a non-judgmental fashion. You just start presented with your life and learning from that. That's a really interesting perspective that I think I'll give more thought to. I've been teaching a course on death and dying for 30 years, and all the students, the professionals I've spoken to, and in my personal life, I find it seems to be true that most people arrive at some phase of acceptance before they die. Not everybody by any means, but the vast majority of people, I've talked to palliative care people and so on, and they all seem to agree that for some reason they can't necessarily articulate what it is they're going through. Maybe it's not, I'm ready to go, as you said, but there does seem to be something about that which I find another hopeful aspect of being a human being. And I hope I'm like that when the time comes for me. But it's another, for skeptical folks, some of these ideas are kind of might be welcomed.
Yeah, I have a close friend who is terminally ill, and the discussions that we have are extremely precious because, as he would say, I don't have a lot of time, and so the use of time he has is really, really important. He doesn't want to waste his time on silly conversations or on people that kind of take energy from him, because there's work to be done, shall we say, in the final weeks, months, or whatever that he knows he has. And it lends, as I say, a preciousness and a solemnity to the connection that we have as friends. And I shared with that friend the idea that, well, maybe we can think of this life as being in the womb. And at some point or other, 9 months or thereabouts, we need to move through the birth canal and out the other side to an unknown realm, which all of us here move through. But if we thought of the dying process itself as a giving birth, it might put the emphasis on a different syllable for many people, and help them go into their final days not with dread and fear and depression so much as wonder and curiosity and openness, narrative openness. Yeah.
This topic we could go on with for some time, but